Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Pickle here, and today we have another BC provincial election forecast. But with no further ado, before we begin, I would just once again like to shout out my channel members. I really appreciate your contributions, and if you guys want to support the channel, by all means go down into the link in the description and join below. Otherwise, if you can't afford to do that, I understand. Just do your regular YouTube things like, share, subscribe, and comment below. But now, let's begin. So the BC election initially last year was looking like it wasn't anything. It was going to be a slam dunk. David Eby was going to just utterly destroy this, and it wasn't going to be interesting. In fact, the most interesting thing, if you could even say that at the time, wasn't who was going to win, but is there going to be any opposition left? Well, now, about a year later from that initial phase when the BC Conservatives were really exploding, we are now looking at an actual real election. I have the NDP up about 6.5 points from the BC Conservatives, and consequently, they have a decent majority. I believe the majority threshold is 46. So they have an 11-seat majority here. Not bad, but much reduced from the 80, 90, possibly 93-seat majority they were looking at last April. And a lot of things have happened here, and it's quite interesting. But before I touch into those, I'll just go through some of this data here. So let's go back all the way to when Rusted was acclaimed leader of the BC Conservatives. At that point, the BC Conservatives were polling 7, 3, 2, 8, 1, like pretty weak, pretty low numbers, pretty negligible. He was booted out of the BC United, joined the BC Conservatives, became the leader because no one else ran against him. And from there, at this stage, this Research Co poll, early May 2023, we are looking at the the David Eby dominating. Not quite destroying everything, but dominating. Then we move forward until June here, this Ledger poll, and we have just the first inklings of the BC Conservatives rising. They're at 16%. The United is at 27%. And at this stage, we're really looking at the NDP is going to destroy this election. It's going to be really big win. And this increases over the late fall. But at the same token, the BC Conservatives start increasing. And then we really start seeing something around the turn of the new year. Instead of having a 25 or like a 26, we're now seeing 34s. And now, most recently, we're at 38 and 37. Now, for a while, there was some contention among polling analyst circles, which amuses me that that is a thing that exists. But it does. It is a thing that exists. That the IVR telephone polls were saying one thing, 34, 38, 38. See what I mean? And the online polls are saying something else. This Ledger poll and this Research Co poll had the BC Conservatives around 27 and about a 44% for the NDP. Meanwhile, or at the exact same time, that the IVR polls are starting to report a close, if not a lead race. And there was some contention for a while on this, and it's basically just boiling down to pick your favorite methodology, pick your favorite pollster. But now we're starting to see the online panels with Abacus here showing the same close race. Now, Abacus has the NDP a little stronger and the Conservatives a little weaker, but it's the same trend line, and that's the important thing. There is going to be some differences between methodology and different pollsters and different techniques. So it's not always going to be necessarily 100% in agreement when something is changing this fast. So I wouldn't say right now that necessarily the BC Conservatives are leading. That's why my model looks like this, and it doesn't look like a BC Conservative lead. For those of you who are veterans of the channel, you would know that I intentionally have my model progress and evolve slowly. In other words, in technical jargon, I have a very low recency bias. In layman's speak, I weight old polls higher than a lot of other people who do these kind of forecasts do. As we get closer to election day, I rate newer polls or increase the weighting of newer polls relative to older polls as we get closer and closer to E-Day. But when we're about 5 months out here, I have the old polls still pretty highly weighted relative to new polls. And the reason I do that, I don't think people's opinions change as fast as polls change. And the reason I don't believe that is essentially polls will get the people who actually respond to polls. Makes sense, obviously. And that's usually accurate for that subsample. And if you do it enough times, it is accurate. Eventually, my model will converge to the polling average, minus plus or minus a little bit because I do some other math and corrections and stuff in there. But barring the stuff that I'm doing that's on top of just raw polls, my model would converge to the polling average eventually. But it takes longer than the polling average takes because there is noise in the polling average. And by reducing the weight of the recency bias, you smooth out a lot of this noise. I'm sure people who are watching this channel have probably looked at 338 Canada before, and well, I have no misgivings to Philip Fournier and his work. He does a good job. By all means, check him out still. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch him. I mean, he does do a podcast, but I'm not saying you shouldn't go to the website or listen to his podcast. He does a fine job. But his model is more sensitive because he has a higher recency bias in it. So it changes more. And I don't like that because I don't actually think people's opinions change that much, that quickly. So by smoothing out and lowering my recency bias, it doesn't happen as much. But anyways, that's a lot of technical jargon. Apologies. If you don't want technical stuff, comment below and I won't indulge myself again. But I don't know. I've been doing this for several years now, so sometimes I want to talk. It's fun to talk about. But anyways, the core gist here is my model is probably underestimating the conservatives right now on purpose because I'm not 100% sold they're that strong, primarily because of this discrepancy between the online polls and the IVR polls. If all the polls start showing around this, I will rapidly be looking at that in my model. But what's worth noting now is even with this, we are still looking at a very strong position for the Conservatives. They're only down 23 seats. That might sound like quite a lot. 6.5 points, 23 seats, that's a big deal. But then you look into it, and it's not actually that bad. You have Kelowna Center here, probably pronouncing that wrong. Richmond Bridgeport, West Vancouver, Capilano, Nanaimo? I don't recall the other part of the name of that. Lance? I don't know. Some parts of Vancouver Island here. Some of the northern outskirts of like Coquitlam area. This riding here that I can't think of the name of. There's too many ridings in Canada. Sorry. Add all those together and you have 14 seats that are within about 8 points. So that means if we actually saw what the polling average said, and the Conservatives were up 2 points, so we have an 8-point swing, that would actually put the Conservatives in a very narrow majority right now, 48 seats. That's not bad. That's a decent position to be in. And there's reason to believe right now that it's going to continue growing that direction because a lot of the underlying factors that has affected the rest of Canada, causing Poilievre to be so dominant, do affect BC. We have things like a generally speaking lackluster healthcare performance. Crime is up quite a bit. Housing prices are disastrous. Immigration's really high, and that causes all sorts of other issues down the line too, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the economy overall in BC is not too bad, but the way people rate the economy is heavily based off of their cost of living experience and essentially how their raises are comparing to how prices are increasing. People are very price sensitive. So I don't think necessarily the relatively decent performance of the BC economy is a nice headwind for Ebby here. I don't think it's actually helping him that much because it's doing what BC is doing fine compared to Canada, but Canada's just doing not very good, so the baseline's not great. Now, you could argue, and I think this is not an unreasonable thing to say, that the economy is doing fine in BC relative to the country. But you can't really blame Ebby for any economic issues in BC per se. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to take. But I don't think that's the position voters are taking, because the important thing to understand here is voters will vote out a government regardless of whether they are objectively good or bad. I've seen some people arguing on Twitter recently that it's unfortunate that Ebby's going to get taken out because he's one of the better premiers on housing. Whether that's true or not, that sentiment actually belies an interesting point. What makes someone good at a subject, at a portfolio? In the case of housing, people are arguing Ebby is a good premier on housing because he's doing all sorts of things that like changing zoning regulations and stuff like that, that in principle, maybe one day in the future will increase housing starts. But for now, it's not. Why is it not increasing housing starts? Well, there's a whole host of issues on that, and it's really out of the scope of this video. But what matters is that it's just not increasing right now. And it's unlikely to increase anytime soon, just because of the realities of the issue. There's just so many headwinds against increasing housing production right now. Interest rates went up quite a heavy bit. They're of the only quantity of labor shortage actually in Canada is construction workers and healthcare workers. So there is a problem with construction workers, and there really is just not the capacity to really build much more. And that's basically what it boils down to. In the long term, it could probably help, but it's not going to help in the short term. So things like that are probably going to take out or are going to be weighed against Ebi, regardless of what policies actions he's taken, regardless of whether they were the right decision or not, regardless of whether he's good on these issues, portfolios or not, because the number one thing that matters is performance, is results. And if people are perceiving bad results, well, you're kind of SOL. Now, there is some remedies to that. If you are doing the correct thing as a government and there is bad results still happening, is you can blame other factors. You can blame other people, other systems. And that can help you quite a bit, actually. That can be basically the deciding factor in a lot of ways. Alberta has used this quite extensively because under Kenny, the UCP wasn't governing the smartest. And they used fighting with the feds, or he used fighting with the feds as a attempt to try to rally support. But in this case, it's very unlikely that David Eby would ever pick a fight with the feds, despite there being a very good case that a lot of the problems in BC are being caused by the feds. But that's what it is. He's not likely to change it because the NDP support the federal government. So he's kind of has his hands tied there. But that would be the only real thing he could do here to try to take pressure off of issues like housing, issues like the economy. Because objectively, on the economy at least, by just basic numbers like median income, BC is doing fine relative to Canada. Canada's doing terrible, but when your baseline is garbage and you're doing something. Picture this, right? 0% or like a 1% growth in median wages is not great. If your baseline's 0, that's fantastic. But he's not likely to make these fights. And that really makes this election, in a sense, for October, kind of a foreshadow of the federal election. Possibly next spring, possibly next fall, depending on whether the NDP wants to play any funny games before the date is done. And it likely will be a good foreshadow. The BC Conservatives' final performance this October will likely reflect heavily on the federal Conservatives' performance in BC. If we get in an event in the most remarkable upset, at least in the last little bit, probably half a century, frankly, where the BC Conservatives pull out a win, that really portends that the Conservatives should be able to win BC by a landslide. A lot of polls are saying that's going to happen, but until that actually happens, we can only really say so much. Now, it's worth noting with that, though, that the polls are putting Poilievre in about 45 to 55% range in BC. That's a lot. That would mean, if this result happens that I have here showing to you on this map, about 32% for the Conservatives, that would mean minimum 13% of BC voters are split ticketing. Now, we know based on previous polls that about half of the BC United voter base is federal Conservatives voters. And by that, I mean like current federal Conservative voters, not 2021, but ones who are going to vote right now. So that would imply, if you combine those two numbers and round around a bit, let's say 40% are voting for the United and the Conservatives of the 45% of the federal Conservative voters in BC, the floor, that is. That would still mean 5% of federal Conservative voters are voting for the NDP or Greens. That's quite a lot. That's actually quite a bit of room for the Conservatives to gain ground. And that actually brings us to an interesting case study that this election gives us. There's often been a line in politics that a lot of, I'm going to say, the old guard of political analysis used a lot. And the old guard was more of a hunch based and less data driven than myself and other people nowadays are. The new poll analysts, if you will, the modelers and all those people were more data driven. And what we're seeing here, the old logic was there was the left and there was the right. It was on a linear scale, and your goal was to try to take everything on your left or on your right, on your flank, and then fight for the center. That's how you get the Aaron O'Toole, Fred DeLaury school of things, where they don't have to focus on worry about the right flank, they have to worry about the center flank. They have to win the blue liberals, and then they win because they're going to get the right flank. What we're seeing here is that everything is more complicated than that. There isn't an obvious left flank, right wing, left wing. People's vote intentions are astronomically more complicated than anyone wants to give them credit for. The average person is very willing to switch from any party to any other party. Yes, you have partisans like your quote unquote truanons or whatever name you want to call them. Every party has them, the hardcore party partisans, people who show up to party conferences every single time they have them, people who work in their local EDAs. Those people, yeah, they're probably not going to switch around very often. But they're a very small minority of the population. We're talking at most 5 to 10% of the population is some form of party partisan. And that's probably a gross overestimate. So that gives us quite a lot of the population is more flexible. They will go from X to Y based on policies, based on vibe. And again, vibe's not a bad thing. All these other considerations too. So let's take this. We're going to take this as a case study. So back in the start of this model, back on October 9th, the BC Conservatives, by my model, had 17 and a bit percent. United was 24%, and the NDP was 45%, and the Greens were 10%. Not a bad position. By the old school model, where you have a left, you have a right, and then your goal is to take your side and then fight for the middle, what we should expect is that the BC Conservatives cannibalize the BC United vote, and then when they run out of that, they should be starting to fight for the NDP vote. And they'll never hit the Green vote because the Green vote is generally considered to be the left of the NDP. What do we actually see instead? Well, May 20th, the NDP has lost 7 points, United has lost 5 points, the Greens have lost 2 points, others lost a point. The BC Conservatives have gained approximately 15 points to 32 total. So that means, for those of you at home, 9% of their gain is from left-wing parties. If we consider other to be right-wing, which in Canada's case usually is right-wing, then 6% came from right-wing parties, if we want to call BCU right-wing, which is a little dubious. They're more centrist than anything else. So that implies that the majority of the gain the BC Conservatives had came from, 60% of it came from the left, and only 40% came from the quote-unquote right. That shouldn't happen on the old school model. The one-dimensional analysis model, NDP voter might go Green, or he might go NDP. Or the NDP voter might go United, or might go NDP. Or the United voter might go Conservative, or he might go United. In that scale, this doesn't make any sense. How are NDP voters going to Conservative? What? The usual reconciliation that you see is, oh, the NDP voter is going to United voter who's going to the Conservative voter, but the United voters are also collapsing. So what's actually likely happening, and we can actually see this in polls, which I think is one of the reasons why this old view is dying out, because modern polling really gives us a better understanding of this stuff, is some NDP voters are defecting Conservative, some United voters are defecting Conservative, some Greens are defecting Conservative, and then some of these other voters are defecting to the other parties. In general terms, what you see in a healthy party is they'll retain 80 to 90% of their base for the last election, which means roughly 10 to 20% of the party, the voters will vote for someone different in the next election. And that's under a healthy, happy party. Then you get someone like the BCU, And you start looking at something like 40% of your voters to 50% of your voters are voting for someone else because the party is in a bad state. They have disagreed with their base, they have made mistakes. And that's really key here. That's the most important thing to notice. It's a really good case study in this. Voter behavior and voter preferences are extremely complicated. And anyone who tries to tell you that in general, voters are going to do X without data, be skeptical. They might be right, but be skeptical. Voters do have trends and they do have behaviors. You can predict how people are going to act. That is absolutely a thing you can do. I do it. So I know what I'm talking about. Of course, I believe that, right? But it's not as simple as most people make it out to be. It's not as simple as I make it out to be. I'm wrong, often, at least on some details. My actual modeling is usually pretty good. The difference here, though, and what's making modern analysis of this stuff probably better, is more data analysis. As a way of comparison, for those of you who might have seen it, there is a good movie out there called Moneyball. And this documents the Oakland A's change in philosophy to use data-orientated baseball, i.e., to use data and statistics to decide who they should put on their team, etc., in order to win the game, win the title, whatever, win the World Series. Now, this is very similar to that. How do you decide what to do as a politician? How do you decide what to do as a party? Well, your two options are old school intuition, which usually is fine, but it can get you into traps where you believe something to be true, so confirmation bias keeps reaffirming it when it's actually not true at all. But the data-oriented side fixes that. You're using things based on what the data says, what the facts are. Now, you can also make the wrong conclusions from that because you can, in fact, interpret data wrong. You can, in fact, interpret statistics wrong. We saw this quite evidently in 2021 when Aaron O'Toole saw the carbon tax was like 60% popular, something like that. Therefore, he should adopt it. That's a mistake because there's, again, more complexity than just what is the most popular thing to do. There's more complexity to voters. There's more complexity to why people vote for a particular party. And again, this is another good case study for BC here. Why are the BC Conservatives doing so well? United has rarely ever done this well. Because if you naively combined United and Conservatives together, which would be incorrect, but if you did it, you'd have about 51% of the vote would be going to those two parties. That almost never happens. If we go back to 2020, together they're only about 36%. You go back further and further in time, and again, it's similar stuff. Let's go here. We can take an exploration. We can take a journey. You go to 2017, 40%. 2013, 44%. 2009, 46%. 2005, 46%. 2001, 58%. That one's a bit of an anomaly. But you see, it's very rare for the right in BC to collectively be in this position. It doesn't happen very often. So why now are the BC Conservatives doing so well? Because again, if we go back to the 2024 polling, we go back to 2023, right before Rostad joined, the BC Conservative United is at 36%. And that's actually a high point. Ledger had 28, Angus Reid did 32. Several months earlier, in 2022, we're looking at 28, 34, 29. Not very strong. Even Kevin Falcon's leadership bump, right after he's nominated, is only 38%. Not strong performance. And then we see now, with the BC Conservatives, they're polling 38, 37, 38. But even before that, we're still getting stronger performance from the Conservatives than we are from the United. And this tells us something quite big and tells us something quite interesting about how politics actually fundamentally works. Voters want a party to believe something. They want a party to have a goal, a plan, an ideal. What the BC United under Kevin Falcon has failed at, you can even point to the name change as an example of this kind of failure, is a structural failure to have a meaning, a purpose, a goal. You see this most poignantly in how Kevin Falcon fired Rustad for having a pretty orthodox, normal view on climate change for conservatives, for right wingers. That it's not a crisis, basically. It's a problem, but not a crisis. There's a difference. Crisis implies like the world's going to end. A problem means it's going to cause damage and hurt people. That makes sense. Anyways, we're not here about climate change. We're talking about this. And that strikes people the wrong way. Because for an NDP voter, that's a dead on arrival view. You can't hold that view as an NDPer. Because the NDP and a lot of the left today, their viewpoint is it's closer to a catastrophe that needs to take serious, real action right now, or else we're going to be destroyed. That's not the view right wingers take. So if you take that position, that the full left wing version of the interpretation of climate change, you're going to alienate a lot of right wing voters. They're not going to like that because that's not what they interpret things. Because a lot of these things, if we go way, way, way back here and invoke the words of James Madison and I think Federalist 34, I don't know, it's been a while since I read them. But anyways, politics in a democracy, in a contested partisan democracy, we could go by my understanding politics series, we call it a Madisonian democracy, which Canada sometimes vaguely is like. In a contested democracy, the point is that Party A and Party B don't believe the same things. If they believe the same thing, there's no reason for Party A and Party B to exist. There's no reason for Party A and Party B to exist. There's no reason for why people would vote for them. There's no reason why people would vote. Again, that's why in Ontario right now, I think we're seeing turnout in the Ford being so low and Ford being so dominant, not because people like Ford, just because there's no point to vote for anyone else. Everyone else is the same. Who cares? In fact, I would actually wager that Ford's biggest threat would be a right-wing insurgent force such as John Rustad, but an Ontario version. But that's an aside. One day I'll do another Ontario update, and then we can talk about that more, if I remember. But here, what this tells us, what's really important here, is voters really do want something different. They want their opposition party to be distinct, to have controversial opinions, to have rough edges. Because if they wanted someone who agreed with the incumbent, they would vote for the incumbent. And that's fundamentally why Falcon's party has done so poorly and why it's just monotonically falling right now. And John Rustad's party is monotonically growing right now. Rustad and the BC Conservatives have taken a clear stance on most issues that affect BC. They have a strong opinion on those things, and they're not afraid to get down and dirty on them. They're not afraid to suffer attacks. Because one thing that I think old orthodoxy has is that having attack ads thrown at you is bad. You don't want to have attack ads against you. I completely disagree with that position. I think a party that wants to win wants the opposition to do attack ads. This is not to say all attack ads are bad. You can have good attack ads, don't get me wrong. But attack ads, you want them to happen. It's the same thing if you are, in a more broad sense, let's say you are a quote-unquote alternative media figure. Let's say, just to pick one name off the top of my head, Tim Pool. If you're someone like Tim Pool, you want other media figures to attack you in a certain sense. Because that, if you are opposed to something, in this case for Tim Pool, like mainstream media, you want mainstream media to attack you because it validates you. In the case of the BC Conservatives, you want the NDP to disagree with your positions. You want to do an attack ad against you. There's some attack ads that have been popping up that I've seen in BC where NDP candidates are saying, oh, so-and-so BC Conservative candidate is pro-life or whatever. Now, old orthodoxy says, oh no, you should run away from that. You don't want that. You don't want to have an attack ad against abortion against you. I hold the opposite view. You want that attack ad. You want the BC NDP to say that. Why? Well, it tells voters that you're a different party. You believe different things. You have different goals. If you believe that your message and your values are better, you want that validation. They would not attack you if they were not scared of you, in a metaphysical sense, not like physical violence scared, if that makes sense. And that is good for a party. Where Falcon makes the mistake in the last year is he doesn't want the media to attack him. He doesn't want the NDP to attack him. He doesn't want to have controversial opinions. He's kind of loosey-goosey. He's timid. He doesn't want controversy. That's why he fired Rustad. That's why people like Bannerman left the party. BC United and Falcon operate under the old school of political orthodoxy where getting attack ads against you is bad. But what we've seen time and again in the day of the internet, if you have a compelling worldview that you hold sincerely and that people can understand and look at, and you are offering real solutions to problems, attack ads against you are good. We saw this with Trump. We see this with Poilievre. We see this with Rustad. We see this with Starmer in the UK. You want attack ads against you because that tells voters, that signals voters that you are opposing the government, that you are against the values of the government, that you and the government are different people. Why does that matter? Well, you're the opposition party. The opposition party is the opposition to the government. Yes, that's a tautology, but the important thing about that tautology is voters want the opposition party to oppose the government. If they wanted the opposition party to be the government, they would vote for the government. If you want someone to vote for you, at the end of the day, doesn't matter if you're left, right, up, down, whatever, you need to give voters a compelling reason to vote for you. And one of the most compelling reasons you can give someone to vote for you is a method and a practice called negative polarization. In other words, letting the party you are opposing paint you negative to them. In other words, they are contrasting themselves to you, and by doing that, the voters who are against the government will see that you're against the government and will come towards you. Now, there's other variations of negative polarization, but that is one mechanism. That is a thing you want. Now, there are attack ads that hurt, and you don't want those to hit you, don't get me wrong. But most attack ads aren't those. Very few are. Some are, but very few. Most are really just painting a picture. Now, that painting a picture can also be quite good if you're in a situation where the opposition can't rally because it's for various reasons, such as, let's say, Harper in 2008 to 2011. The opposition can't really rally against him. Same thing with Ford right now, because it's too split. Attack ads there work because, yes, they draw a distinction between, say, the liberals and the conservatives, but there's also a distinction between the NDP and the conservatives. So it's not clear for voters where to go. There's not a nice filtering. So it doesn't equal the same result. Here, you could say, oh, but isn't United and the conservatives, won't they do that? No, because Falcon has shown time and again, he doesn't want to be distinct. He tries and he pretends to be it. He tries to copy Rustad. He hugs up to Poilievre whenever Poilievre shows up in BC. But it's clearly an act for everyone looking at this. It's something that he's doing that he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's mimicking something because it worked, not because he understands it. And that's fundamentally why I don't think we'll see the United do well. At this point, just Falcon is winning his seat, and I wouldn't be surprised if in a few months that's not true anymore. I wouldn't be surprised in a few months if the Conservatives actually win in BC. In fact, personally, I'm expecting it. My model doesn't say it, but I'm expecting it. The polling is showing in that direction, and everything is suggesting it's going that way. But only time will tell. So with that, I'll wrap it up here. So if you liked the video, by all means, again, like, share, subscribe, comment below. But with that, I will see you again. Bid you adieu.